And here, this book. I did a search on the archaic meaning of exile, and this book comes up in Google Books, Exile, Ostracism, and Democracy, The Politics of Expulsion in Ancient Greece. This book explores the cultural and political significance of ostracism in democratic Athens, in contrast to previous interpretations. Sarah Forsdyke argues that ostracism was primarily a symbolic institution whose meaning for the Athenians was determined both by past experiences of exile and by its role as a context for the ongoing negotiation of democratic values. Okay, regarding exile, Sarah Forsdyke has written a book and is explaining the symbolic meaning for the Athenians of exile and ostracism, because it was something that happened in the past, and its ongoing importance or significance is for the purpose of the negotiations for democratic values. So they only talk about it based on the past because of its ongoing democratic values. We're going to get a little more into this book and try to figure that out, because I can't understand if she's saying that it wasn't as bad as it seems, or it didn't really exist anymore at this point in, I guess this was about 380 BC she's talking about, 400 BC. But we're going to read a little more about it, because what she's mainly talking about is the rhetoric that the democratic proponents used to put down tyranny. That there was a lot of rhetoric saying, oh, the tyrants exiled a bunch of people and ostracized people. They were so bad for that, and that's why democracy is so good. But it's like, to me, this is like the downfall of literature, because we're reading a book of someone analyzing the rhetoric of literature from the past to come up with a contemporary idea about what was going on then, instead of teaching people to read the literature of the past and analyze it themselves. You've got a person writing a book where she's analyzing it for you, which, you know, there is some help, you know, something good for that. But what if that's rhetoric in that book? What if she's biased? So everything she's writing to explain to you about what they said in the past and what it really meant, if she's biased and it's rhetoric, then you need to analyze her book in order to read it. So why not just learn to analyze the original works yourself and use the methodology taught by Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, and us all learn that and learn to read and recognize rhetoric and be able to investigate the literature of the past ourselves. I mean, yeah, it's got to be translated, but there's a certain level of our own intelligence that should be engaged so that we can go and read those books ourselves. And here we are reading a book where someone else is explaining it to you. And that's something that to me has been really weird for a long time. But let's listen to some more go over some more of what she says in it. And the point of this book we get to here. Herodotus' narrative concerning the Corinthian tyrant Cypselus and Periander is embedded in a larger account of the origins and early successes of the Athenian democracy. I have argued in previous publications that this larger context reveals the democratic ideological origins of Herodotus' version of the story of the Corinthian tyrants. I argued that several details of Herodotus' narrative demonstrate slippage between an earlier archaic tradition in which rival elites were the victims of the tyrant's brutality and a democratic version in which the entire citizen body suffers from the tyrant's injustices. In this section and those that follow, I demonstrate that arbitrary expulsions were a key feature of the representation of tyranny in Athenian democratic ideology. Okay, see, this kind of reading and discussion is what isn't being held by the general population anymore, like it was at the time the founders established America, or settlers came to America and were working out the details of the new government in the new world. Because most people were reading this stuff at that time, and now we have contemporaries who are writing for university level students, I suppose, and Ms. Forsdyke is one of them. And what we just heard was arbitrary expulsions were a key feature of tyranny according to Democrat ideology. So I think what she's suggesting is that rhetoric was used by the Democratic ideologues to support democratic values and prove that it's a better way, because the tyrants weren't really as bad as we think they were, maybe. She's saying that the oligarchy of the 30 tyrants, there wasn't as much exile as the Democrats suggest, it seems, is what she's saying. That it wasn't bad for all of the citizens. The tyranny wasn't as bad as the Democrats made it out to be. That's what I'm hearing. We're going to read a little more.
A key feature of the representation of tyranny in Athenian democratic ideology. The immediate context for Herodotus' account of the Corinthian tyrants is a proposal by the Spartans to restore the sons of the tyrant Pisistratus to power in Athens. The Corinthian Socles objects to this proposal and describes the brutal rule of the Corinthian tyrant Cypselus as an example of the evils of tyranny. He drove many Corinthians into exile, and he confiscated the property of many, but mostly he killed people. Three facts besides the rhetorical style of the sentence lead us to suspect this statement is a highly selective and indeed thoroughly tendentious representation of Cypselus' rule. First, this wholly black picture of the tyranny conflicts strikingly with Socles' earlier account of an oracle predicting that Cypselus would bring justice to Corinth.
Okay, she just said that Herodotus' account of the brutality of the tyrants contradicted with an earlier account of an oracle's prophesying about how good the tyrant would be.
No one would justly praise the mildness of those men, the 30, rather than that of the people. For when the 30 took control of the city by vote of the assembly, they killed 1,500 citizens without trial, and they forced more than 5,000 to flee to Piraeus. But when the Democrats were victorious and returned under arms, they put to death only those most culpable for the wrongs, and dealt so honorably and lawfully with the others that those who banished them fared no worse than those who returned. It is clear from this example that earlier traditions concerning the relation of tyranny to exile influenced the representation of the rule of the 30 in the 4th century. In particular, the blurring of the distinction between the small group of exiles who fought to overthrow the 30 and the mass of Athenians who were expelled from the city alone is explicable not simply by the need for reconciliation following the Civil War, but also by the role of the mass expulsions and the legitimization of democratic rule. In these traditions, mass expulsions illustrated the harmful effect of non-democratic regimes on the citizen body, in implicit contrast to the moderation of democratic rule. The 30 sent many citizens into exile with the enemy. Many citizens they killed unjustly and deprived of burial. Many men who had citizens' rights they disenfranchised. The daughters of many men they prevented from being given in marriage. We might compare this with Herodotus' representation of the rule of the archaic tyrant Cypselus, cited above. Father left the land. Eusthyrus at first wanted to kill us, but we ran away, and although we lost our city, our lives were saved. So we are in exile, wandering, exchanging one city for another, for in addition to the other wrongs, Eusthyrus dared to commit this further misdeed against us. Wherever we are staying, he finds out and sends heralds to demand our surrender, and he shut us out of the land. Just as in the story of Periander and Lycophron, the tyrant first banishes the victims from his own territory and then issues a decree demanding that they be shut out from places where they seek refuge. Athenians made use of this myth in important civic occasions, such as funeral orations, interstate negotiations, and dramatic performances. As we have seen, the central event of this myth is the Peloponnesian tyrant Eusthyrus' unjust banishment of the children of Heracles and their reception by the Athenians. Athenian versions of the myth of the Heraclidae moreover, show clear structural parallels with Herodotus' account of Periander. In both stories, there is a progression from an initial banishment from the immediate territory of the tyrant to subsequent banishment reinforced by decree from the places where the exiles seek refuge.
Okay, so some banishment was mythology and used in plays when they wanted to celebrate the occasion of giving people homes that they say was what happened in this mythology. Let's go to some other places where exile is discussed. It seems to have been a hot topic around this time, but first let's figure out exactly where we are geographically.
500 BC. The Iron Age Celts and their relatives dominate much of Europe, whilst in the Mediterranean land a number of brilliant city-state civilizations, most notably the Greeks, now flourish. A succession of great empires, the Assyrian, the Babylonian, and now the Persian, have dominated the Middle East for the past few centuries. Bantu farmers from West Africa are beginning to spread out across the continent. The return of urban civilization to ancient India has been followed by a creative period in its history with the founding of Buddhism. Attica, Athens, there's Athens, which is right in here. And what is Greece today? Okay, we have Israel, 1200 to 1050 BC, which we saw was split in 600 and the lower portion became Judah. C. Thessaly, Thessalonians, Thessalotus, and Babylon's right here, the Fertile Crescent, Assyria, Sumer, Babylonia. That is right in here. And Greece is over here. So now we can see that in 500 BC, the Fertile Crescent, Babylon's over here, Israel's over here, and Greece is over here. So it was a boat ride away.
Okay, so by water, Greece is about 900 miles from Israel. 32-hour drive today by land. And Babylon was about 500 miles. And you saw that people were captured and taken to Babylon. So I think if you're not captured, but you're just kind of traveling back then, even though you're walking, I don't think it would have been too odd to travel between those places, especially by boat.